For the berries block, we have the beige print, a red print, and a green print. I'm going to use the back basting method of applique, at least for part of this block. So I have traced my pattern onto the wrong side of my background fabric. If we look at the pattern, our order is going to be the leaf goes first because it's behind the stem, then the stem has to go down, and then the berries go on because they're on top of the stem. My stem is stitched down and I'm ready to make the berries now. I could go ahead and do it with back basting if I wanted to, but I decided the berries were close enough to round or ovals that I would use a starch and press and basting method. So I cut my berries out of a Templar heat resistant template plastic. So that's one that's cut out. And then on the wrong side of my fabric, I put my template and I just traced around it. You can use whatever you want to mark with, just don't use something permanent that will bleed through the front. It can be permanent if it just stays on the back. You do want to make sure that you can fit all of your pieces on here, and I've already cut the rest of them out. You need to leave enough space between them that you can cut a seam allowance for all 4 of them. So once I have traced it, then I'm just going to cut it out, leaving about 1/4 of an inch beyond my drawn line. And then I'm going to baste around the edges inside the seam allowance, and you can use whatever thread you want for this. Again, something that you want to get rid of, that you don't want to use on your sewing machine or whatever, is a good choice. You don't want too light of a thread because you don't want it to break when it pulls up. So once you've basted all the way around, then the template that you traced gets popped into the middle. Mine was actually that way. And we're going to pull our basting threads up. And then you just want to make a knot on the back. It doesn't matter what color your basting thread is because it's not going to show. So now my berry is gathered around my template. So then you can use spray starch or sizing or best press. I use sizing most of the time, but I'm just going to spray a little bit into the cap, and I've already done that. And then you will need a paintbrush. It doesn't matter what kind of paintbrush. I'm using some that I have from Toll Painting, but even the inexpensive ones that come in the little watercolor boxes will work. So I'm just going to get that seam allowance nice and wet with my starch or sizing or best press, and then I'm going to press it dry. And you will probably have to flip it over and press on the other side as well because we want it to be stiff. So once I've pressed it dry, now all I'm going to do is come back in and clip some of those basting threads. You don't have to pull it out, and just fold the seam allowance back, pull my template out, and it can be reused again. And there's my berry all ready to stitch. This is my finished berry block. I have not trimmed the background down. For the basket block, we have 3 pieces of fabric: the cream or beige print, which is our background, our blue print, which is the basket, and then we have the flag print, and that's what we're going to make the yo-yo out of. For the basket block, I use starch and press. So just center your basket on the block after you prepare it and stitch it down. You could also do back basting. My favorite way of making yo-yos is using the Clover Yo-yo maker. On this project, I'm using the size small. They do come in several different sizes. So the yo-yo maker has 2 parts to it. It has the part that they call the plate and the part that they call the disc. These little slots here are where we're going to be stitching from. We're going to go up on one end and down on the other, and it just depends on which direction you're going around the yo-yo, whether you start on the right side or the left side. If you're going counterclockwise, you would start on the right. If you're going clockwise, you would start on the left. So we're going to take the plate and the piece of fabric we want to use for our yo-yo. We want to know what the right side is, and the right side goes down into the plate So the right side is going to show on this little hole on the back. Oh, also the plate has these little notches that stick out. There are 3 of them. And when we go to put the disc in, we're going to match the lines with those notches. So I'm just going to take my disc and check back here to see where my notch is. It's right there. And I'm going to pop it in, and that's holding my fabric inside the plate. So just like that. And now we're going to trim this down, leaving a small seam allowance. And for me, it works really well to just tip the fabric over the edge and kind of run my scissors along the edge of the plate. So I'm just going to cut all the way around. I mean, don't tip it up like this and cut it. It would be tipping the fabric over the edge and running the scissors right next to the edge of the plate. We need enough to stitch through. Okay, so now we're ready to start stitching. I'm using a quilting thread because it's heavier, and a good size needle works just fine. If you don't have quilting thread, then your regular sewing thread, double it up. We don't want it to break when we go to pull these up. So I'm going to flip this over, and I'm going to stitch from the plate side because then I can see where my stitches are supposed to be. And I like to start with a notch here so that I can keep track of where I was. Your thread doesn't necessarily have to match. Most of it is going to disappear when you pull your yo-yo up. So I'm going to bring my needle through in this first hole, and remember that the discs had these little notches out of it, so they're lining up so we can do our stitches too. So I'm going to come up on the right side, go down on the left because I'm working counterclockwise, come up on the right side of the next one, down on the left. And once you get in the groove, you kind of get used to where those notches are. So we're going to stitch all the way around in those little slots. And when we're stitching, I'm folding my seam, or my seam allowance, back inside on the disc. So I'm actually folding through a layer on this side and the layer that's in here. So just so you can see what's happening on the back side. So I am folding it over. I'm trying to catch it. All the way around. So here I am back at my notch, which was my starting point. And I do take a stitch back through the slot where I did my first stitch. Okay, so I've stitched all the way around, and now I'm going to put my finger in that hole and pop the disc out, and I just open up my seam to get it out of my fabric. So now I'm finished with that, and now it's just a matter of pulling up my thread to gather the whole thing. And then you can manipulate it a little bit. To get it how you want it. You wouldn't have to pull it up super tight if you don't want to. You could leave a little bit of a hole. It's kind of up to you. And the smaller the yo-yo makers are, the more you have to futz with it. The bigger ones are a little bit easier to use in my opinion. And now I just need to knot this off when I have this arranged how I want it to be. So I can just take my needle into the crease and make a knot, or if you know you're going to be sewing your yo-yo down to something so the back doesn't show, you can just take your needle down through the center of your yo-yo, pull it up, and then do a knot on the wrong side. Clip it off. So I can still play around with it a little bit if I want to, till it looks how I want it to look. And there's my finished yo-yo. If the only yo-yo you're ever going to make is the one for this project, or you just don't want to invest in the yo-yo maker, then this is the traditional way to make yo-yos. You need a circle that is about twice as big as what your finished yo-yo is going to be. So you have a 3-inch square in your kit, so that's the maximum you can go. So you either can get a compass and make a template. What I did was just went and got a cup that fit on that square, traced around it, and then cut out my circle. So once you have your circle cut out, you are going to then start folding in the seam allowance. Again, I'm using quilting thread, and we are going to baste around the edge of this, folding in the raw edge as we go. You don't want super teeny tiny stitches because the bigger ones will make it gather up a little bit better. The nice thing about the yo-yo maker is your stitches are evenly placed, same size, so you will get the same gathers every time. You won't necessarily with the traditional way. So I'm just going to keep folding the raw edge in and basting all the way around, and I'm going to finish doing that off camera. This is a little slower for me than going through the yo-yo maker. I've stitched all the way around my circle, pulling the raw edges in, and now it's just like after we pop it out of the yo-yo maker from the previous version. I'm just going to pull up my threads and manipulate it to how I want it. And if I'm going to be sewing yo-yos together so the back shows, then I'll make a knot here in the crease. If they're going to be appliqued down to something so the back doesn't show, I'm just going to run my needle and thread through to the back and make a knot there. So, pros and cons. For the pro for the yo-yo maker is, as long as my fabric is big enough to snap in between the disc and the plate, I can just cut my circle right then. I do not have to make a template and then cut it out separately. It's easier to turn the edges in on the yo-yo maker. A con is there are only 4 or 5 sizes of the yo-yo maker. With the traditional method, you can make it any way you want, any size you want. With the yo-yo maker, your stitches are evenly spaced, so you get the same amount of gathering every time. But if you wanted to play with that, then the traditional way would be better. So either one will work. Then you're going to take the yo-yo you made and you can position it however you please on the basket. The pattern, just so you know, shows it centered on the basket. Now you could either just tack it down through the center and then it would be loose, or you can whip stitch around the edge to hold it in place. For the Coffin Star block, we have a brown rectangle, a beige rectangle, and a blue rectangle. From the brown and the beige, we are going to cut 2 1 3/8 inch strips. It doesn't really matter how long they are, so I'm not even going to clean up the short ends. So I'm just going to cut them both at once. I'm going to set them on top of each other. Clean up one long edge. 1 3/8 times 2 is 2 3/4. So I'm going to cut a 2 3/4 inch strip. And yes, you do have some extra on the beige or the cream because I miscut one month and I'm using up the rectangles this month. I'm going to back my ruler up to the 1 3/8 inch mark and cut. So I should have 4 1 3/8 inch strips, 2 in the beige and 2 in the brown. I am going to sew these strips together like this. So all 4 of them go together and they're just alternating. Brown, beige, brown, beige. I've sewn all my strips together and pressed them all one direction. Doesn't really matter which way. And then from this we need to cut 4 1 3/8 inch strips. Oh, this should measure 4 inches. I'm a little bit short, so I'm going to compensate for that in the triangles. I'm not tearing it apart, but I am trying to keep this straight when I'm cutting, so I'm trying to line up some lines with the seams. I'm going to clean cut this. 1 3/8 times 4 is 5.5 inches. So I'm going to line up my 5.5 inch mark on that line, or that side that I just cleaned up, and cut. Then my next cut is 4 1/8, and if you want to, you can use that itty bitty ruler we talked about a while back, so that might be better. So again, I'm lining up lines on my seam allowances, and I have my 4 1/8 over here on my cut edge. And make sure when you're using this ruler you're following all the way out to make sure you're on the right line. So 4 1/8. I'm going to back that off to 2 3/4. So again, I'm lining up lines on my seam, on my edges, if you got it exactly right. So 2 3/4 is right here, following it all the way out to the line to make sure I've got it, and cut. And finally 1 3/8. But every single time I'm lining up lines on my seam lines as well as my cut edge to measure my 1 3/8. So now, once I have my 4 strips cut, I'm going to turn every other one around. Whoops. This one. So that I get a checkerboard pattern, and I'm going to sew those rows together. And my seams, because I pressed them all one direction, are going in opposite directions and will nest. Once my rows are all sewn together, I'm going to press the seams all in one direction. And this should be a 4-inch square now. Mine is just a hair less than that, not even 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to cut my triangles a little bit bigger. But what if your square was a little bit bigger than 4 inches at this point? In that case, I would go ahead and take slivers off the edges until you got it to 4 inches, because I don't think your eye will pick up that it's just a hair off on those outside ones. So the pattern says to cut 2 2 3/4 inch squares from our blue piece. It is big enough that I can cut it, just big enough that I can cut 4-inch squares. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. You could do that. If you can't get 4-inch, then get 3 7/8. Even the 3 3/4 may be big enough because it is oversized and will be trimmed down. So I'm just barely getting the 8. So it would be 8 by 4. That's what I'm cutting here. If you're cutting the size of the pattern, it would be 7.5 by 3 3/4. And if you were cutting that, Then we would back up to the 3 3/4 mark because I'm making mine bigger. I'm going to the 4-inch mark. And whatever size you cut, you're going to cut both those squares in half once on the diagonal to end up with 4 triangles. So now, those 4 triangles, we're going to sew it just like it was a square in a square unit. We're going to visually center. You can fold and find the center if you want to, and sew them onto opposite sides. We'll press out toward the blue, and then we will add the last 2 triangles. Sew those on, and again press out toward the blue. I've pressed my triangles out toward the edge, and now I need to trim my block down to 5.5 inches. So half of 5.5 is 2 3/4. So I want my 2 3/4 marks on my ruler running through the points both directions. So at least if I possibly can. 3/4. Now, remember mine was off by a little bit. So if yours was exactly 4 inches, you also, your inside piece, you also want your 1/4 inch mark running on your points. If yours was a little bit smaller, you're going to have a little bit more than 1/4 inch outside on that outside edge. So I want to split the difference on the 2 sides. So if it's a hair more, I want a hair more on both sides. Once I'm happy with what I'm seeing, I'm going to trim 2 sides. I'm going to rotate, and now my 5.5 inch mark goes on those 2 pieces that I just cut, or those 2 sides, sorry, not pieces. And so there's my finished block, and because my inside square was a hair less, then when I go to sew this to other blocks, it's going to be floating a little bit. I'm not going to hit those points. I can live with that. This is not a show quilt. If you can't, then you would have wanted it to rip way earlier. For the black and green block, we have a black strip that's a little bit wider than the green strip. We have a black rectangle and a green rectangle. The very first thing we're going to do is cut a 1-inch strip off of our black section. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and clean cut just that one edge. And then I'm going to cut a 1-inch strip off of there, so the short way, just off the end. You want to do this before you cut your other pieces from this piece of fabric. We'll set that aside, and then out of what's left, we need 2 strips that are 10.5 by 1 inch wide. I'm going to go ahead and fold my strip in half because for my work area it's too long, and the ruler that I'm using. So I do need to square up the other end, and I'm just going to go ahead and square the whole thing up again. So because it's a 10.5 inch strip, I want this to be straight when I'm folding it. So I do have my line on the fold. Going to cut, to walk around, and it's 2 1-inch wide strips, so let me go ahead and cut a 2-inch strip first. So long line on here, again a line on the fold and a line on your short end would be a good idea to keep everything straight. And I'm going to back off to the 1-inch mark. And I could just put my 5-inch mark on the fold and cut it. No, that's not right, 5 1/4. But I'm going to go ahead and open it up and cut my two 10.5-inch strips. So just my 10.5-inch mark down on the short end, any line on the long edges to keep it straight. And cut. And same thing on the other one. Cut. From my green strip, I'm cutting a 1-inch strip. Again, I'm working on the fold, and I'm putting a line on the fold, and you probably have a selvage on the end of your strip, so you do want to cut that off. Walk around, line up my 1-inch mark, and again, lines on the fold and on my cut edge would be good to keep it straight. I'm going to cut, and from this 1-inch strip, I need 2 pieces that are 2 1/4, and then 1 piece that's 10.5. So I'm going to just go ahead and cut my 2 1/4-inch pieces off. And then I'm going to open this up and cut my 10.5-inch piece. So, and cut. So you have a little bit of scrap there. That black strip we trimmed off the end, you might as well go ahead and trim it down to 2 1/4. It's wider than that because I gave you a wider piece of fabric, but it's going with the 2 green strips that are 2 1/4, so it'll just make life a little bit easier if we trim it down 2 1/4. And then once we've done that, we are going to sew green strips on both sides of that one, and then on our 10.5-inch strips, the green strip will be in the middle, and we're sewing the 10.5-inch black strips to both sides of that green strip with a 1/4-inch seam. For both strips, I pressed toward the black. Now from our shorter piece, we're going to cut 2 1-inch slices out of it. This should be a 2-inch section now after you've sewed everything together going this way. So I'm going to line up lines with my seam to keep everything straight. I'm going to clean up one edge, and then I'm going to cut it. I'm going to cut 2 inches off of it, which is a little bit hard to see since it's black and green and it's blending in with my mat. And then I'm going to back up and cut off another 1 inch. Let's try switching to the itty bitty 8th, see if we can see it any better. Maybe a little better, maybe not too. So 1 inch. And then from my longer strip, I'm going to again clean up one end. So I'm lining up lines with the seam. Slice off the end. I need one piece that's 1 inch wide. And then I need 4 pieces that are 2 1/4, and I am going to cut them one at a time. But 2 1/4 times 4 is 9 inches. So I can line up my 9-inch mark with my clean cut end. Cut off that end. Then I need to back it up 2 1/4, so that would be 6 3/4. Do it this way. Oh, 6 3/4. I'm still lining up lines with that seam. It just makes life that much easier. So, and then to 4 1/2 after that. Come on. and then to 2 1/4. So that will give me my 4 2 3/4 inch, 2 1/4 inch sections. From my black and my green rectangle, I'm cutting 2 3-inch squares, and I have mine stacked on top of each other, right sides together, as it'll just save me a step later. So I'm going to clean up my 2 edges. I'm going to walk around, and 3 times 2 is 6. So I'm putting my 6-inch mark down on my short cut end, my 3-inch mark on my long end that I clean cut. And I'm going to cut. Then I'm going to back my ruler up to 3 inches and cut. So now I'm either going to mark one line point to point, diagonal through the ruler, and so 1/4 inch from that line on each side, or I can use my magic wand or other tools that do the same thing. Line up my scored line on my corners and mark both lines, in which case I will be sewing on the lines, because we need 4 half square triangle units. I've sewn my black and green squares together 1/4 inch from the center line on the diagonal on both sides, and now I need to cut those apart between the lines. And once we've done that, we are going to press toward the black, and then we need to trim these squares down to 2 1/4 inches. So I'm using the block lock. You can use just a regular square ruler if you want to. So I make, with the block lock, I'm making sure my point is on the seam line, the groove is on that seam allowance. I want to make sure that I'm going to have 2 1/4 down here on this end after I trim the first 2 edges. And I'm just going to rotate it, and if it does that to you, it's not a big deal. Just put the block back on it. And I'm going to line up my 2 1/4 inch mark on the 2 edges that I just cut, and cut the last 2 edges. So I'm going to trim all my blocks down, all my half square triangle units down to 2 1/4. Now that we've cut our strips down, we're going to take the 1-inch strips and put them together to make a 9 patch. So you'll just do them like this, and our seams are going opposite directions, so they should just nest together. Okay, after I sewed the 3 rows together to make the 9 patch, we're going to press the seams in toward the center. Now that all my various sections are sewn together, I'm ready to put the whole thing together into just a slightly irregular 9 patch. So we're going to go row, row, row. So make sure your black is pointing out away from the center, and everything else, it should be kind of obvious how it lines up. Once I sewed my rows together, I pressed in toward the center on the top and bottom row, and out away from the center on the middle row. And now I just need to sew those rows together, and the seams should all be going in opposite directions, so it should all nest and go together pretty easily. Here's my finished black and green block. The pattern says to press the seams in toward the center. I chose instead to pop the seams, and so that I got little 4 patches in here. Either way will work.